Immaculate Conception. That's one side. But he became convinced, there are various suggestions as to how that happened. He became convinced that the Society of Jesus was a danger to himself and to the state. One of the things that was immediately antecedent to the suppression there was a thing called the Riot of the Capes and Sombreros in 1766. Charles III, when he came, he had been king of Naples, brought with him his ministers from Naples. He wanted to impose a revolution upon Spain, a revolución de arriba, not from below but from above. Spain, he thought, was retrograde. We're going to change things. We're going to have a new kind of commerce. We're going to have a new kind of government, autocratic indeed, or monarchical, a new kind of government. We're going to have new ways of dressing. Capes and sombreros are old-fashioned stuff, and you put those capes on and pull the sombrero down, you can conceal wickedness and thievery. So he put in sumptuary laws. You got to dress like people in France. All hell broke loose at that. Not because of that necessarily, but it was the final straw that followed upon the imposition of heavy taxes by these Neapolitan ministers. Riots broke out in Madrid. The king had to flee. The home of the prime minister was torched. It seemed to be getting out of hand. A bunch of the Jesuits managed to quiet the riots. You would think the government would have been happy with that. Aha, you were so naive. If the Jesuits could stop the riots so easily, guess who started the riots? The Jesuits themselves. It's obvious, isn't it? They convinced the king of that. There was also one story that one of his major ministers forged a letter supposedly from the general of the society to one of the provincials, which called into question the legitimacy of the birth of the king, Charles III. To call the king was not only an insult, to call him a bastard, but it meant that if he were such, he had no right to rule the country. Charles, for some reason, became convinced that the Jesuits really had written that letter, and he effected, or the Spanish government effected, one of the most efficient operations that ever a Spanish government had. In 1767, at the end of March, the governors of each of the regions, the provinces of Spain, received a sealed packet telling them they were only to open it 3 days later under pain of death. When it was opened, they had 3 days to get every Jesuit in the province that he governed out of their houses, on the road, to ships to be taken out of Spain. It was an extraordinarily effective thing. But due to the goodness and kindness of the king's heart, they were allowed to take with them the clothes that they had on, and one other change of clothes, their breviary, and whatever chocolate or tobacco they might have in their possession. Why that, I'm not sure. But he stopped their mouths also by offering each of the Jesuits a small pension to live on after they got out of the country, out of the goodness of his heart, but only on the condition that they never said or wrote anything publicly against the abolition of the society there. If they did, the pension was gone. How were they going to support themselves? They were also dumped on the Papal States. Naples and Parma followed in 1767 as just little followers of the other three. We're up to 1767 now, from 59 to 67, 8 or so years. It became clear after that happened, despite the remonstrances of the Pope on each of those instances, that the governments were not going to be stopped on this, but what they really wanted was the universal suppression of the entire Society of Jesus around the world, for all of the reasons, and among many others, that I just read to you there. That was going to depend upon the Pope. Clement XIII was old, ill, and had been an ardent defender of the society against pushes by all of these monarchs. And remember, there was no such thing as democratic elections or public opinion to stop them at the time. But they insisted that they wanted the society suppressed. Clement XIII refused. France took over took back Avignon, which the Holy See had had in its possession for half a millennium, and Naples simply took property on the borders of the Holy See in Naples and told the Pope they'd get those back when he had suppressed the society. Clement XIII refused to do so. Now we come to the possibility of a new Pope after the death in 1769. Clement XIII dies. What happens then? A conclave is supposed to be held within the beginning of it, within 2 weeks of the death of a pope. Obviously, this was the chance, if any, to get someone elected that would be favorable to the suppression of the society. Who were the electors? Cardinals. Who were the cardinals? What did cardinals do? What do they do now? Basically, they're either the residential cardinals, like Cardinal George here, for example, or Cardinal Dolan in New York, people who were the bishops, or archbishops rather, of major sees in the church. You're familiar with that. There were also curial cardinals. That is, the cardinals who ran the offices of the Vatican, the curia of the Holy See. And you're familiar, I presume, with that. Whether you like them or not, you're familiar with them. But then there were also the state cardinals, something we're completely unfamiliar with at the present time. They were cardinals who, especially after the end of the Reformation and post-Reformation, Catholic Reformation, they were cardinals who were insisted upon by the Catholic monarchs to be appointed by the Pope to be guardians of the interests of Spain or Portugal or France at the Holy See. They were not ambassadors, but they were cardinals within the cardinalatial group that had as their first job not the good of the whole church, but the good of the state, France or Spain or Portugal or the Holy Roman Empire. That good first in the context and light of the church. There were state cardinals, curial cardinals, and, as I said, residential cardinals. Among them, there were certainly some, as Clement XIII once said to the then general of the society, Father Ricci, your greatest enemies are not outside of Rome. Some of the cardinals were fiercely opposed to the Society of Jesus. And that doesn't make them monsters, necessarily, of course. Some were fiercely opposed because they thought the society, in its doctrines, and what it was teaching, especially in moral theology, laxism, for example, and especially in its what today we would call its enculturation theories, but were called accommodationist theories at the time. In other words, that the church in a particular country, China, for example, or India, should be enculturated, should take on and be in itself influenced by the culture, the mores, the activities, the history of the country, while at the same time, presumably giving people in that country the riches of the church and the riches of Catholic teaching. An enculturation that doesn't simply impose one way of looking at theology, one way of looking at the church, one way of looking at secular society. The Jesuits got into terrific problems, especially in China. The Chinese rites, R-I-T-E-S, the Chinese rites controversy over 100 years or so. And to put it in its simplest terms, the Chinese had, among other customs or superstitions, depending on your point of view, or idolatry, they had the custom of venerating Confucius, the man who more than any other person was responsible for the whole cultural matrix within which Chinese society grew, and the veneration of their ancestry, the veneration of grandparents, great-grandparents, as the people who back generation after generation kept them connected with their own society. Were those simply social customs, Or was the one of them idolatry, paying worship to Confucius, and the other superstition of venerating the ancestors of the past? Fights went on for almost 100 years. It's too simple to say, but I will say it nonetheless, that the fight on one hand was the Jesuits, who were very much, not all of them by any means, very much involved in this enculturation process, and the Dominicans and Franciscans on the other side, who understandably thought that accommodating these practices was watering down the faith, was not preaching the simple, solid, clear doctrine of Jesus Christ. The Jesuits were not doing that. And they were accommodating themselves to all kinds of things there. The fight went back and forth in China, but it got eventually, of course, to the Holy See, which published, depending on the latest piece of information that came from either side, from China to Rome, which might take 3 to 5 years by ship. Again, we didn't have Twitter. But depending on who got the latest information, the Jesuits were right, or the Dominicans were right, or this was blasphemous and sacrilegious, or it could at least be accommodated. But finally the Holy See came down on the side, though back in the 1600s, at one point it had already said the entire missal, the Mass, including the canon of the Mass, could be in Chinese. In the 1600s. And we were fighting about that as a possibility at Vatican II only 50 years ago. But finally the Holy See came down on the other side, condemned the Chinese rites as superstition and idolatry, forbade the use of them in any way. They sent a delegate, an archbishop, to tell the Chinese emperor, the delegate didn't know a word of Chinese, to tell the Chinese emperor what these rites meant. What effectively it did, it hobbled the life of the church in China for more than 200 years. But there were good, serious people within the Vatican who were quite convinced that the Jesuits were snakes, you know, that they were destroying the purity of the gospel. And they were determined they would be rooted out. There was one group which included 3 cardinals, the head of the Vatican Library, and archives, by the way, no reference to anybody here. 3 cardinals, the head of the Vatican Library, and the general of the Augustinians, that met once a month for better than 5 years, and the agenda was how to get rid of the Jesuits, how to destroy them. Those were some of the backgrounds of before the conclave ever began. Once the conclave began, it was clear that there were some of the cardinals who under no circumstances would countenance a candidate who would suppress the society. In other words, there were some cardinals who were absolutely against anything like the suppression of the society. There were some cardinals who were openly desirous of the suppression for the peace of the church and the purity of the Gospels. And there were some cardinals in the middle. Well, maybe the society should not be suppressed, but maybe it should be for the peace of the church. The Society of Jesus is not the Roman Catholic Church, and maybe it should be, depending on what the circumstances were. Well, who were the cardinals available? And who was going to influence those cardinals? The state cardinals were given instructions by their own governments. The Spanish cardinals did not leave Madrid until they had received instructions from the Spanish government as to which of the cardinals, and we've got lists of them from the archives, those who were favorable, those who were absolutely unfavorable, those who were tolerable. The Spanish cardinals, as I said, did not leave Madrid until they had their instructions, and the Spanish ambassador to the Holy See made very clear to the conclave that if they proceeded to voting before the Spanish cardinals got there, the Spanish government would withdraw its ambassador to the Holy See. And the Holy See was worried about that kind of thing. They recognize not only their ambassadors there, but what would the governments do if they were pushed against the wall by the church? given the fact that they'd already pushed the Jesuit out, what else would